He laughed. That was the part Claire Whitmore could never explain to anyone afterward. Not the words themselves, but the laugh. Easy. Unbothered. The kind of laugh a man uses when someone mentions something completely beneath his concern. My marriage, Damien said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. It's nothing more than a contract with a signature. Claire was standing 8 feet away, close enough to count the crystal pendants on the chandelier above his head, close enough to watch the men around him smile like he'd said something clever. He never looked at her. Not once. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the one person who was supposed to see you, you already know what happened inside Claire's chest in that moment. And if you've ever loved someone who treated your love like a liability, then this story belongs to you. Don't go anywhere. Hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what Damien Whitmore said in 30 seconds took him 3 years to pay for. This is where it begins. The gala was called the Whitmore Foundation Charity Evening, which was the kind of name that made powerful people feel generous without actually requiring them to be. It was held every October at the Harrington Grand, a hotel in downtown Chicago where the chandeliers cost more than most families earned in a year, and the waitstaff had been trained never to make eye contact unless spoken to first. Claire had attended every year since the marriage. She knew the routine. She knew which aldermen drank too much by 9 o'clock, which business partners brought wives they were clearly tired of, and which members of Damien's inner circle watched her just a beat too long whenever Damien wasn't looking. She knew the gala was not a charity event. It was a performance. And for 3 years, she had played her role without complaint. She wore deep burgundy that night. Not because Damien had suggested it, he hadn't mentioned her dress at all, but because it was the color she'd chosen when she bought the gown 6 weeks earlier, standing alone in a boutique on Michigan Avenue while his assistant texted her the event details. She'd held the fabric against herself and thought, this is the one. And then immediately thought, he won't notice. She went anyway. Damien had arrived at the hotel separately. That happened more often than not. Separate cars, separate arrivals, then the practiced reunion at the entrance where he would place his hand on the small of her back and they would walk in together, and Claire would feel, for about 40 seconds, like she was part of something real. That night, the 40 seconds felt shorter. You look nice, he said, which was what he always said. Not beautiful. Not that color, just nice the way you'd compliment a hotel lobby or a business presentation. Then someone called his name from across the lobby, and the hand left her back and he was gone, and Claire stood in her burgundy gown in the middle of the Harrington Grand and became invisible. She was good at invisible by then. 3 years of practice. She found her seat at the head table, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and did what she always did at these events. She watched. She watched the room arrange itself around Damien the way water arranges itself around a stone. Men moved toward him instinctively. Conversations redirected themselves in his direction. He had that quality, the ability to make every space feel like it existed to accommodate him, and Claire had once found it magnetic. Standing at the edge of it now, she mostly found it exhausting. Victor Hale found her first. He always did. Victor was Damien's oldest advisor and the closest thing the Whitmore organization had to a conscience, which was not saying much, but it was something. He was 63, gray-haired, and had the permanently tired expression of a man who had spent 40 years managing other people's disasters. He liked Claire. I was one of the few people in Damien's world who treated her like a person rather than an accessory. You're doing the face, he said, settling into the chair beside her. What face? The one where you're smiling at the room, but your eyes are somewhere in Boston. He accepted a champagne flute without looking at the waiter. You okay? I'm fine. That's the second most convincing lie you tell. The first is when you say the car ride over was fine. Claire turned to look at him. I don't say that. You said it last year, and the year before. Victor glanced toward where Damien stood at the center of a cluster of men in expensive suits. He was late picking you up both times. Claire said nothing. She lifted her champagne and took a sip, and watched her husband work the room and thought, not for the first time, that Damien Whitmore was genuinely extraordinary at everything except the specific things she needed him to be. That was the cruelest part. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel or cold the way the rumors sometimes suggested. He could be funny, quietly, privately funny, in a way that still surprised her. He remembered small things. He had once, without being asked, tracked down a first edition copy of her favorite childhood novel because she'd mentioned offhandedly that she'd lost hers in a move. He wasn't indifferent to her. He just kept choosing everything else first. And 3 years of being chosen second had worn something smooth and raw in her chest, like a stone turned over by water too many times. Dinner was served. Damien came to the table eventually, sat beside her, and for approximately 20 minutes the evening felt almost normal. He asked about a gallery show she'd mentioned wanting to see. She described it. He listened. Actually listened, not the half-listening where he checked his phone between sentences. She thought this is who he can be. And she felt the familiar pull of it, the hope that came with every moment like this, the dangerous belief that maybe this time the moment would stick. Then his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, and the 20 minutes ended. He didn't leave the table. He just left, in the way that he always left. Body present, mind already 3 moves ahead in whatever business had just demanded his attention. Claire watched it happen and thought, there he goes, with a tiredness that had replaced the grief somewhere around year 2. The speeches started at 9:30. Gerald Croft gave the first one. Gerald was a city councilman who owed Damien several favors and expressed gratitude through public praise the way some people expressed it through cash. He was excellent at this. Warm, anecdotal, convincingly sincere. And when he raised his glass toward the head table and said, "To Damien and Claire Whitmore, one of the finest partnerships in this city," the room applauded with genuine warmth. Claire smiled. She was very good at that smile. She'd built it over 3 years. The right amount of gracious without being performative. The right amount of warmth without being eager. She turned to look at Damien. He was already smiling. Not at her. At Gerald, at the room, at the performance of being praised. He raised his glass. Then a man near the end of the table, one of the newer investors, young, a little drunk, clearly trying to impress, laughed and said, "To the strongest marriage in Chicago." And Damien laughed. That was the first thing. The laugh. Easy, dismissive, the laugh of a man who finds a compliment slightly absurd. "My marriage," he said. His voice was calm, conversational, the same voice he used to discuss quarterly figures or dismiss a contractor. "It's nothing more than a contract with a signature." The table went quiet. Not silent. The rest of the room was still noise and movement and crystal. But the 12 people at the head table went quiet in the specific way people go quiet when they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Claire felt Victor go still beside her. She felt the weight of eyes moving toward her face, calculating her expression, waiting to see how she would absorb it. She kept the smile. That was the thing she would remember longest, that her face kept doing what it was trained to do while something structural collapsed inside her. She held the champagne glass, and she kept the smile, and she looked at the flicker of candlelight on the tablecloth, and she did not look at Damien. He hadn't looked at her either. That was the sentence. That was the whole of it. Nothing more than a contract with a signature. Not said in anger, not said cruelly. Said the way you'd correct a misapprehension about a business arrangement. Matter of fact, slightly impatient with the misunderstanding. Like the idea that his marriage could be called strong was a bit of an overreach. The young investor laughed nervously and changed the subject. Victor reached for his water glass and said nothing. The moment passed the way moments like that pass in rooms full of practiced people, quickly covered, smoothly forgotten, tucked under the continued flow of the evening. But Claire was already gone, not physically. She sat through the rest of dinner. She accepted the dessert she didn't eat. She thanked Gerald when he stopped by the table to say goodnight. She shook hands with people whose names she had learned and relearned across 3 years of events like this one. She did all of it. But something had closed, some final door that she hadn't even known was still open. Later, in the car, a separate car, because of course Damien stayed to finalize something with someone, she looked at her left hand on her knee. The ring caught the streetlights as they passed. 3 years ago, Damien had placed it there in a ceremony that was quiet and precise and had made her cry, which embarrassed her at the time because she'd thought she wasn't the kind of person who cried at weddings. She slid the ring off. It came off easier than she expected. She held it for a moment, this small circle of platinum, and then she set it on the seat beside her and looked back out the window. The driver didn't notice. Or if he did, he was too well trained to react. At the mansion, she went upstairs, changed out of the burgundy gown, and stood in the closet for a long time looking at the clothes arranged on her side. The gowns and the silk blouses and the structured blazers that comprised the wardrobe of Claire Whitmore, wife of. Then she pulled a single bag from the shelf. She didn't take much. A week's worth of the clothes she actually liked. Her passport. The small notebook she'd carried since college. A photograph of her mother. The first edition novel Damien had tracked down for her. She took that too, because whatever it meant about him, it meant something about her, about who she'd been when he gave it to her, and she wasn't ready to leave that version of herself behind entirely. She left the ring on the kitchen counter, not the bedroom, because the bedroom felt too pointed. She wrote a note. Then she crossed out what she'd written. Then she wrote, "I heard you." And she left it under the and she walked out of the house that had her name on the deed but had never felt like hers. The car she took was her own, the one she'd bought before the marriage, a 7-year-old Volvo she'd kept in the secondary garage, because Damien's staff considered it an embarrassment. She liked that car. She liked that it had 140,000 miles on it. And the passenger seat adjusted slowly, and the radio sometimes lost the signal in tunnels. She liked that it was just a car, without any weight attached to it. She drove north for 20 minutes and then pulled into a gas station and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry in a very long time. Not from sadness, exactly. From the specific exhaustion of having held something together for 3 years that had not, apparently, been holding together at all. Then she dried her face and pulled back onto the highway and drove east toward Boston. She had an apartment there. She'd kept it secretly, not out of deception, but out of something closer to self-preservation, some instinct in her, even at the beginning, that said, "Keep one thing that is entirely yours." It was small, and the heat took too long to warm up in winter, and the upstairs neighbor walked heavily at odd hours. She loved it. She had not told Damien it existed. She drove through the night. By dawn, she was crossing into Indiana. By noon, she was in Ohio. She stopped at a diner somewhere outside Cleveland and ordered coffee and eggs, and sat at the counter next to a man reading a newspaper and felt, for the first time in 3 years, completely anonymous. No one in the diner knew her name. No one connected her to Chicago, or to Damien, or to any of it. She was just a woman in a booth with a coffee cup and a 7-year-old Volvo in the parking lot, and no one needed anything from her. She finished her eggs. She left a tip. She got back in the car. Behind her, in the mansion on the north side of Chicago, Damien Whitmore came home at midnight to a house that was quiet in an unusual way, found a ring on the kitchen counter and a note with 2 words, and stood there long enough that the motion sensor lights clicked off and left him in the dark. He stood there in the dark for a long time. Then he turned the lights back on and went to her room and found the small bag missing and the photograph of her mother missing, and the first edition novel missing, and understood something he would spend the next several months trying to convince himself he hadn't understood. He picked up the ring. He held it the way she had held it in the car, like a question he didn't have an answer to. Then he set it back down and went to his office and sat behind his desk in the house that was worth $8 million and contained approximately nothing he needed right now, and stayed there until morning. Nobody came to check on him. That was the thing about being the most feared man in a city. The fear kept even the people who might have helped him at a careful distance. He had built that distance himself, deliberately, over decades. He just hadn't understood until tonight what he'd built it around. Damien Whitmore did not sleep that night. He sat behind his desk until the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the particular colorless white of a Chicago morning in October, and he did not move except to pour 2 glasses of scotch that he didn't finish. The ring sat on the corner of his desk, where he'd carried it from the kitchen without thinking about why. He didn't look at it directly. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound you can't identify. Peripheral, persistent, impossible to ignore. At 6:15, his phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, his operations director, calling about a shipment issue in the port district that required a decision before 7. Damien answered on the second ring, gave the decision in 4 sentences, and hung up. Then he sat and looked at the ring again and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, she is already gone. Not just from the house, he understood that. He meant something deeper. That the version of Claire who would have come back by morning, who would have waited in the guest room until he found her and apologized in the clumsy, insufficient way he usually apologized, that version was gone. Whatever she had been holding on to across 3 years had finally let go, and Damien knew enough about letting go to recognize that it didn't reverse. He just didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet. By 7, the house had started its morning routine. The kitchen staff arriving, the security rotation changing over, the quiet machinery of a household that ran whether its owners were present or not. Damien showered, changed, and came downstairs to find his assistant, Nora, waiting in the front hallway with his schedule printed and annotated and a coffee he hadn't asked for. Nora was 28, efficient beyond what her salary warranted, and one of the few people in the organization who spoke to Damien directly instead of carefully. She looked at him for exactly 1 second before looking at her clipboard. "You have the Caruso meeting at 9, she said, and Victor called. He wants 15 minutes before the meeting. Set it up. Also, she paused, just slightly. Mrs. Whitmore's security detail reported she dismissed them last night, around 1 a.m. Damien picked up the coffee. I know. They want to know how to proceed. Stand them down. Nora wrote something. And if she... Stand them down, Nora. She nodded and said nothing else, which was one of the reasons she was still employed. Victor arrived at 8:30. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He simply appeared in the doorway of Damien's office, the way he'd been appearing in doorways for 30 years, with the expression of a man who has already formed his opinion and is deciding how much of it to share. He sat down across from Damien without being invited. How bad? He said. She left. I know she left. I watched her face when you said it. Victor leaned back in the chair and studied the ceiling for a moment. What I'm asking is how bad you let it get before last night. Damien set his coffee down. That's not a conversation I need right now. No, it's a conversation you needed about 18 months ago, which is probably why we're here. Victor's voice was even. Not unkind, but not gentle either. He'd long passed the age where he softened things for Damien. She's been disappearing in pieces for 2 years, you know that. Victor, I'm not saying it to say I told you so. I'm saying it because you need to understand what you're dealing with. This isn't a fight. She didn't storm out angry. She packed a bag. He paused. People who pack bags have been deciding for a while. Damien was quiet. Outside this window, a car moved slowly down the street. He watched it without really seeing it. She left her ring, he said. Victor didn't respond to that immediately. Then, where'd she go? I don't know. You could find out in 20 minutes. I know. But you're not going to. Damien looked at him. Not yet. Victor held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. He understood the distinction Damien was drawing, even if he wasn't sure it was the right one. The Caruso people will want a decision on the northern expansion by end of week, he said, shifting. That's a separate problem. Everything is a separate problem today. Welcome to consequences. Victor stood, straightened his jacket. For what it's worth, and I recognize it might not be worth much, what you said last night was the ugliest thing I've heard you say in 30 years. And I've heard you say some ugly things. He left before Damien could respond. Damien sat with that for a long time. The Caruso meeting was brutal in the specific way that meetings are brutal when one party wants something the other isn't sure they want to give. The Caruso family controlled distribution networks across 3 northern states, and their representative, a careful, flat-eyed man named Sal Renetti, who had been doing this for 25 years, came to the table with numbers and maps and the quiet confidence of someone who knows his leverage. The northern expansion would double the organization's reach. It would require 8 months of sustained attention, travel, and the kind of focused commitment that Damien had built his reputation on. 6 months ago, he would have looked at Renetti's numbers and felt the familiar pull of it, the hunger for scale, for the clean satisfaction of making a complex thing work. Today, he looked at the numbers and felt nothing. He signed what needed signing. He confirmed the preliminary terms. He moved through the meeting on instinct and habit and the muscle memory of 3 decades. And afterward, when Renetti had gone and his lawyers were gathering their papers, Marcus Webb leaned across the table and said quietly, "We good?" "We're fine," Damien said. Marcus studied him for a beat. Marcus was 41, ex-military, and had been with the organization for 12 years. He was not perceptive in the way Victor was perceptive, but he noticed operational irregularities, and Damien's current state qualified. "Claire's not home," he said. It wasn't a question. No. You need anything? No. Marcus nodded and let it go because that was what Marcus did. He identified the situation and accepted the parameters. Damien appreciated that more today than usual. The first week passed the way the aftermath of damage passes, in a kind of suspended unreality where everything functions and nothing feels right. The organization ran. Damien ran it. Meetings happened, decisions got made, money moved through the channels it was supposed to move through. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside the mansion, Claire's absence had a specific texture. It wasn't that her things were gone. Most of her things were still there, 3 years of accumulated presents. Books stacked on the nightstand, a cardigan left on the back of a kitchen chair, handwriting on a grocery list held to the refrigerator by a magnet she'd bought at some museum he couldn't remember. All of it still there. Only she wasn't. The kitchen staff asked, on the third day, whether they should continue preparing meals for two. Damien said yes. He didn't know why he said yes. He ate alone anyway. On the fifth day, he called Victor. "Have you heard from her?" he asked. "No," Victor said. Then after a pause, "Have you tried calling her?" "She's not picking up." "How many times?" "Twice." "That's not trying, Damien. That's checking whether she's available." Damien hung up. He was not accustomed to being the person waiting. His entire adult life had been structured around being the person others waited for. Waited to hear from, waited to receive permission from, waited to displease. The discomfort of being on the other side of that had a specific physical quality, like wearing a coat that didn't fit. He moved through rooms restlessly. He slept poorly. He found himself standing in her doorway at odd hours, not doing anything, just standing there. On the eighth day, he did what he'd been avoiding and had Marcus run a quiet trace. Not surveillance, just location. He needed to know she was safe. He told himself that was the only reason. Boston. She was in Boston. He stared at the single word in Marcus's text for a long time. Boston. Of course, he'd known she had history there, school, years before they met. He hadn't known she had a current address there, hadn't known about an apartment, which meant she had kept something from him, which meant she had been planning, not this specifically maybe, but a version of this. She had kept a door open that he hadn't known about. He should have felt something about that. Betrayal maybe, or anger. What he felt was something closer to respect. He put his phone down and didn't call her. 2 weeks in, the cracks started showing in the organization. It started small. A shipment held at customs longer than it should have been, because the usual contact expected a call from Damien directly and got Marcus instead, and read that substitution as a signal. A meeting with a city official who had questions about the foundation's financials. Questions that were routine, probably, but required Damien's personal presence to remain routine, and Damien had canceled twice. Victor handled the rescheduling with his usual precision, but the official left the third meeting looking thoughtful in a way that Victor didn't like. "You're distracted," Victor told him on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week, standing in the doorway of the office again. "And people are noticing. I'm handling everything." "You're present for everything. That's different." Victor came in and sat down. He looked tired, more tired than usual, the permanent weariness deeper than its baseline. "The Caruso expansion needs your full attention starting next month. That is not a negotiable thing. Renetti will read any hesitation as weakness and renegotiate everything." "I know." "Then what is the plan here? Because from where I'm standing, you are a man sitting in an $8 million house waiting for something you're not willing to go after." Damien looked at him. "What would you have me do? Show up in Boston, knock on a door she didn't tell me about, and ask her to come home?" "That is one option, yes. She doesn't want to be found. She doesn't want to be managed. There's a difference." Victor's voice sharpened just slightly. "You've been managing this organization for 20 years and you're very good at it, but you managed her the same way. You made decisions about what she needed and when, and you administered those decisions from a distance, and now you're surprised she found a door you didn't know about." He paused. "She's not a territory, Damien." The silence after that had weight. "I know what she is," Damien said, quiet, flat. "Then act like it." He didn't sleep that night either. In the morning he went to her room. Not his room, her room, the one she'd chosen when they worked out early in the marriage that they kept different schedules and different temperatures and he moved too much in his sleep. and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the books on her nightstand. 3 of them. A novel he didn't recognize, a book about coastal geology, of all things, and underneath those a small notebook, not the one she'd taken with her, a different one, that he hadn't known was there. He didn't open it. He sat with it in his hands for a long time and didn't open it because opening it felt like the kind of violation that couldn't be undone. And he had already done enough things that couldn't be undone. He put it back exactly where he'd found it. Then he called Victor and told him he was pulling out of the Caruso expansion. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that Damien checked to see if the call had dropped. "Say that again," Victor said. "The northern expansion. I'm withdrawing." "Damien." Victor's voice was very careful now. "That deal is worth— I know what it's worth. Renetti will not take this quietly. He will see it as— I don't care what Renetti sees it as." Another silence. When Victor spoke again, the careful quality was gone, and what replaced it was something raw. The voice of a man who had known Damien Whitmore since he was 22 years old and had watched him build everything, brick by careful brick. "Is this about Claire?" "It's about me." Damien stood, moved to the window. Below, the street was gray and beginning to rain. "Tell Renetti I'm honoring the preliminary terms and walking back the expansion clause. Give him the compensation figure we discussed in August. He'll take it. And if he doesn't, then he doesn't." Damien watched the rain start to hit the glass. Set up the call. He heard Victor exhale, a long, slow breath of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. "Okay," Victor said. "Okay, I'll set it up." He hung up. The Renetti call happened 2 days later and was every bit as hostile as Victor had predicted. Sal Renetti did not raise his voice. Men like Renetti never raised their voices. But the temperature dropped 8 degrees over the phone, and the message arrived clearly. This withdrawal would have cost beyond the financial compensation. Relationships in their world were built on reliability and momentum interrupted was trust diminished. Damien accepted that. He agreed with Renetti's assessment, in fact. He simply didn't change his decision. After the call, Marcus came to his office and closed the door, which he rarely did. Marcus was ex-military, and ex-military men have a specific way of delivering bad news. Direct, fast, no emotional scaffolding. 3 of the Caruso network guys have been asking questions, Marcus said, about our northern operations. Quietly, but asking. What kind of questions? Structural questions. Who reports to who? Who holds what contracts? Marcus paused. The kind of questions you ask when you're thinking about whether a structure could accommodate different leadership. Damien was very still for a moment. That's fast. Renetti's fast. That's why he survived this long. Marcus held his gaze. You want me to address it? Not yet. Boss, not yet, Marcus. Damien's voice was quiet, but the edge in it was the edge that had ended arguments for 20 years. Marcus recognized it. He nodded once and left. Damien sat alone with what was developing. He was not naive about it. He had been in this world long enough to understand exactly what Renetti's speed meant, that the withdrawal had been read as instability, and instability in this world was an invitation. Not immediately, not overtly. But the questions being asked now were the early-stage mapping of a potential move, and if he didn't respond with visible strength soon, the questions would become something more actionable. He should have cared more about that. What he kept thinking about instead was the notebook on Claire's nightstand. He hadn't opened it. He wanted to. Not to know her secrets. He was past that particular impulse. But because her handwriting had always grounded him in some way he couldn't explain. The specific slant of it, the way she pressed harder on certain letters, the small habit she had of circling words she was uncertain about instead of crossing them out. He'd watched her write 100 times over 3 years, and he'd never told her that it was one of his favorite things about her. He'd never told her most of his favorite things about her. He thought about what Victor had said. She's not a territory. He thought about that for a long time. Then he went to her room, and this time he picked up the notebook, and this time he opened it. Not to a particular page, just where it fell open naturally, to a page in the middle that had been visited more than the others. The spine softened there from repeated opening. The handwriting was Claire's, and he recognized the date in the corner. 2 years ago, almost exactly. November. I keep telling myself this is a season, she'd written. that he's building something and seasons end. But seasons are supposed to change, and I've been waiting through the same one. He read it twice, and then he turned back to the front of the notebook and read forward, slowly, and what he found was not what he expected. It wasn't accusation or anger or the list of grievances he might have braced himself for. It was something harder to absorb than anger. It was a woman trying, consistently, across 2 years of brief entries, to find the version of events that let her stay. Trying to believe the next quarter would be different, or that the canceled dinners meant something other than what they meant, or that the way he looked at her sometimes, across rooms at events like last week's gala, with something in his expression she could never quite name, was enough. She had wanted it to be enough. She had tried, with everything she had, to make it enough, and it hadn't been. Damien set the notebook down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and sat like that for a long time in the room that smelled like her. He understood something now that he hadn't understood when he picked up the ring from the kitchen counter. He'd thought, in the first days, that the problem was the sentence, the 30 words at the gala table that had finally broken something. And that was real. He'd said something unforgivable in a room full of witnesses. But it wasn't the source. The sentence was just the moment the accumulated weight became too heavy for the surface underneath. He had done this slowly, over years. One canceled evening at a time, one redirected attention at a time, one moment of choosing the organization over the marriage until the choices had compounded into a verdict. He couldn't take any of it back. He could not take back 2 years of notebook entries. He could not take back the gala. He could not take back the 30 words or the fact that he hadn't looked at her when he said them. What he could do, what he was sitting with now, in the room she'd slept in alone for most of their marriage, was decide what happened next. Not for the organization, not for the Renetti situation, or the northern expansion, or the customs delays, or any of the machinery that kept grinding whether he attended to it or not. For himself. For what he was willing to become. He picked up his phone. He didn't call Claire. He knew she wouldn't answer, and he had nothing formed enough yet to say. He called Victor instead. "I need Margaret's number," he said. "Margaret Lawson." A pause. "Damien, Margaret hasn't been with the family in 4 years. I know, I need her number." Another pause, longer. Victor understood what the name meant. Margaret Lawson had been the closest thing to a neutral party their world had ever seen. The woman who had run the household before Claire arrived, who had known Damien since before the Empire, who had a relationship with Claire that existed outside the organization's usual channels. If Damien was asking for Margaret's number, he wasn't planning to send a lawyer. "I'll send it," Victor said carefully. "But Damien, if you're going to reach out to her, you need to know what you're actually asking. Because if Margaret goes to Claire and it goes wrong, that's the last door." Damien looked at the notebook on the bed beside him. "I know," he said. "There's no recovering from a last door." "Victor?" His voice was very quiet. "Send me the number." The line was silent for 3 seconds. Then Victor said, "Sent," and hung up. Damien looked at the number on his screen for a long moment. Outside, the rain had intensified, coming sideways now against the window, and the room was getting dark. And somewhere in Boston, in an apartment he hadn't known existed, Claire Bennett, not Whitmore, she was already back to Bennett in her own mind, he understood that now, was living a life that didn't include him. He had built his entire world on the principle that he controlled the outcome of things. That preparation and leverage and the willingness to hold a position longer than the other party could create results. He had never been wrong about that. He was wrong about it now. He pressed call. The phone rang 4 times, and then Margaret Lawson's voice, warm, cautious, older than he remembered, said, "Damien." Not Mr. Whitmore, just his name. "I need a favor," he said. "The last one I'll ask." The silence on her end told him she already knew what it was about. Margaret Lawson picked up on the 4th ring and said his name like she'd been expecting the call for weeks. Maybe she had. Margaret had always operated slightly ahead of events, not through any particular gift, but through the specific attentiveness of a woman who had spent 30 years watching powerful men make avoidable mistakes and had learned to read the preliminary signs. She'd left the Whitmore household 4 years ago, after Damien's mother passed, and the need for a household manager gave way to the leaner, more corporate staff structure Nora eventually filled. She'd left on good terms. She always left on good terms. That was one of the things about Margaret. She had a talent for exits. "You want me to go to her?" Margaret said. Not a question. "I want you to deliver something, and I want you to see how she is." Damien paused. "I'm not asking you to bring her back. I'm not asking you to argue for me." "Good, because I wouldn't." "I know." "What are you delivering?" He looked at the notebook on the bed. He'd been sitting in Claire's room for over an hour, and the rain was still coming hard against the window, and the room was dark enough now that the shapes at the edges were softening. "A letter," he said. "I haven't written it yet." "Then why are you calling me tonight?" He didn't have a clean answer to that. The honest answer was that he needed to tell someone what he was going to do before he could make himself do it. That saying it aloud made it real in a way that only thinking it didn't. He'd been like that since he was young, before the empire and the reputation and the careful management of his own image. His mother had known it about him. Claire had known it too, he thought. She'd just stopped being in the room when he needed to say things. "I'll write it tonight," he said. "Can you leave for Boston by Friday?" "I can leave Thursday." "Thursday, then." Margaret was quiet for a moment. He could hear something in the background, a television, or maybe rain on her end too. "Damien," she said, "when I see her, if she asks me what you're like right now, what do I tell her?" He looked at the ring on the nightstand, where he'd placed it after carrying it from the kitchen. He hadn't put it back in its box. He'd just set it there, on the wood surface, where it caught the ambient light from the hallway. "Tell her the house is quiet," he said. "Tell her I noticed." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Write the letter, make it real. She'll know if it isn't." "I know she will." "And Damien?" Her voice shifted slightly, taking on the particular register she'd used when he was younger, and had done something she needed to address directly. "Whatever you wrote in that letter, mean it before you send it. Not because you want her back. Mean it because it's true." He said he would. He hung up. He wrote the letter that night. 4 drafts, 3 of them thrown away. Not literally, because Damien didn't throw things, but deleted from his screen, the cursor selecting and erasing. The problem with each rejected version was the same. They were constructed. They had the architecture of argument, the organized logic of a man who knew how to present a case, and Claire would read the architecture before she read the words, and she would know. She always knew when he was managing something. The 4th draft he wrote without organizing it first. He just started with what was true and followed it. He wrote about the dinner in their 2nd year of marriage when she'd cooked something complicated, some French technique she'd spent 2 days practicing. And he'd come home 3 hours late and eaten it cold, standing at the kitchen counter, while she sat at the table pretending to read a magazine. He'd thanked her. He hadn't sat down with her. He'd thought at the time that he was being efficient. He understood now he'd been telling her something about her place in his priorities, and he'd been telling her clearly, and she'd heard it. He wrote about the night she'd been sick, actually sick, fever, and the whole thing, and he'd arranged for the doctor to come to the house and then left for a meeting before the doctor arrived because the meeting was time-sensitive. He'd told himself he'd handled it. The doctor was coming, wasn't he? She had what she needed. He'd told himself that for 3 years, and he understood now that what she'd needed was him sitting on the edge of the bed and being present for something that had nothing to do with his agenda. He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't promise he was changed, because he understood that claims of change meant nothing and evidence of it was the only currency that mattered. He just wrote what was true, in the order it came, and at the end he wrote, "I don't know how to be what you needed. I'm learning what that means. I wanted you to know I'm learning it because of you, not because you left. You leaving just made it impossible to keep not knowing." He read it once. Then he folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote her name on the outside. Claire, not Claire Whitmore, just Claire, and set it on his desk. Then he went to bed and slept, badly but completely, for the first time in 3 weeks. Thursday arrived with Marcus Webb's face outside his office door at 7:45 a.m. and the particular set of Marcus's jaw that meant operational problem, not administrative. "Renetti moved," Marcus said. Damien put his coffee down. "What did he do?" "Called a meeting, not with us, with the Alara Group. Portside distributors, 3 of the independent contract holders, and 2 of our northern liaisons." Marcus came fully into the office and closed the door. "Our northern liaisons, Damien, the ones who've been with the organization for 8 years. "When?" "Last night, Sable Restaurant, private room. Our contact there gave us the rundown this morning. Marcus set a single sheet of paper on the desk, handwritten notes, the kind that didn't get entered into any system. Renetti told them the expansion was still viable, with different leadership at the top. Damien picked up the paper. He read it slowly. He's not moving to take over the organization, Marcus said, watching him. He's moving to fracture it, peel the northern operations away, create a satellite that he controls through the Alara group. He paused. It's smart. It's also something he's been thinking about for a while. This didn't get organized in 3 weeks. Damien set the paper down. He thought about that. About what it meant that Renetti had come to the expansion meeting with this already partially prepared, that the expansion offer itself might have been partly diagnostic, a way to assess Damien's focus and appetite. And Damien had sat across from Renetti and been distracted and then pulled out of the deal, confirming whatever Renetti had been measuring. Who else knows about the meeting? Damien asked. Victor. Nobody else yet. Keep it that way until I decide how to respond. Damien stood, moved to the window. Who are the 2 liaisons? Petrov and Callahan. He knew both men. Petrov was purely mercenary. He would follow the money without apology, which at least made him predictable. Callahan was more complicated. Callahan had been with the organization since Damien's father's time, which meant his presence at Renetti's table was either opportunism or something had genuinely broken in the loyalty structure that Damien hadn't seen. Get me a meeting with Callahan, Damien said. Private. Today, if possible. And Petrov? Petrov, I already know what he'll do. Give him a number that makes staying more rational than leaving and he'll stay. Callahan I need to talk to. Marcus nodded and left. Victor arrived 11 minutes later. He came in, sat down, and looked at Damien with an expression that was not quite I told you so, and not quite sympathy, and was really its own thing that Victor had developed over decades of watching exactly this type of situation develop. How long? Damien asked. Has Renetti been planning this? My guess is 6 months, minimum. Probably started when you delayed the expansion decision back in May. Victor folded his hands on the desk. The withdrawal just moved his timeline up. He was going to move eventually regardless. Yes, but you gave him ideal conditions. Victor said it without malice, just accuracy. A distracted principal, a visible emotional disruption that the whole room watched happen at the gala, and then a major deal withdrawal with no public explanation. From outside, that reads as instability. Renetti reads instability as opportunity. He's not wrong to. Damien sat down. The morning light was cold and flat through the window, the kind of October light that gave everything a forensic quality, like the city was examining itself. What do you think the move is? Depends on what you want. Victor held his gaze. If you want to protect the organization in its current form, you take a hard public position, you meet with Callahan and make clear the cost of disloyalty, and you go back to Renetti with enough force that pulling back becomes the more appealing option. He paused. That is the operational answer. What's the other answer? Victor was quiet for a moment. The other answer is you figure out what you actually want your life to be, and you build toward that, and you accept that some structural costs are going to come with the transition period. Another pause. But I want to be direct with you about what that means. That path has real danger in it, not abstract danger, the kind where people make moves that can't be undone. The room was very still. Are you telling me Renetti's a physical threat? Damien asked. I'm telling you Renetti is a practical man who sees a window and is in the process of deciding whether to go through it or not. Right now, the window is financial and organizational. If you don't address it, it can become something else. Victor leaned forward slightly. You've operated in this world long enough to know how that progression goes. Damien knew. He'd seen it happen to other men, other structures, other moments of perceived weakness that became invitations that became actions. He'd watched it happen from the outside and understood it as a law of the environment, as predictable as gravity. He just hadn't applied it to himself before. He'd always been the most stable point in any room he was in. He'd always been the one doing the reading. Callahan arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He was 54, broad, with the permanently weathered look of a man who had spent 30 years in conditions that had not been gentle. He'd come up through the ports. Originally, the cold and the long hours and the physical grind of that work were still visible in the way he moved, the way he used his hands, even now years removed from it. Damien had always respected him. He was honest in the way that people who'd earned everything themselves are honest, without theater, without performance. He sat down across from Damien and didn't apologize for being at Renetti's table, which told Damien that this conversation was going to be real. "Say it straight," Damien said. Callahan looked at him directly. "You've been somewhere else for a month." "Yes." "People notice. In our world, when this man at the top is somewhere else, people start thinking about what happens if he stays somewhere else." Callahan's voice was even, uninflected. "Renetti didn't recruit me. He invited me to a conversation, and I went because I needed to understand what was forming. I haven't committed to anything." "But you're considering it." A pause. "I'm considering what my options are. That's not the same thing." Damien studied him. The honest answer from an honest man. "I went to see what was on the other table." He couldn't be angry at Callahan for that. In their world, loyalty was not unconditional and shouldn't be. Loyalty was earned by the kind of leadership that made staying the most rational choice. He hadn't been providing that lately. "I'm going to ask you something directly," Damien said, "and I want an honest answer, not the answer you think is safest." Callahan waited. "If I come back to full operational focus starting today, not partially, fully, what's the damage I'm looking at in the northern operations?" Callahan thought for a moment. Not the performative pause of someone deciding how much to reveal, but the genuine consideration of someone doing an honest calculation. "Petrov's already half out. You could get him back with money, but his reliability after that is probably 60%, which isn't worth the risk in anything sensitive." He paused. "The two independent contract holders Renetti talked to are probably fine. They're cautious men. They went to listen. They won't move unless Renetti has something fully formed and proven to offer. Right now, he doesn't." Another pause. "The structural problem is the Alara group. If Renetti and Alara formalize something that reroutes 3 of your northern shipping channels, and there's not a clean workaround, what would stop the Alara formalization?" "Speed. If you're back and visible and the organization reads as stable before they close their agreement, Alara won't risk the conflict." Callahan held his gaze. "But that's a narrow window. Renetti's moving fast because he knows you can recover quickly if you decide to." "How narrow?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Damien nodded slowly. "And you? After this conversation?" Callahan looked at him for a long moment. "I'm still here, aren't I?" he said. "I don't leave through the front door and then go out the back." Damien felt something loosen slightly in his chest. "No," he said. "You don't. I know that about you." Callahan stood. "Handle Renetti," he said simply. "People will reorient around demonstrated stability. They always do. It's the uncertainty that sends them looking." He left. Marcus came in as soon as Callahan's car cleared the driveway. "Well?" "He's solid. Petrov's gone. Manage Petrov's access to sensitive operations starting immediately. Don't tell him why." Marcus made a note. "And Renetti?" Damien thought. 2 weeks. The window to prevent Alara from formalizing, to prevent the organizational fracture, to demonstrate the kind of visible stability that would reorient the network around him again. He knew how to do it. He'd done it before, in smaller versions, moments where the organization needed to feel the ground under its feet again, and he'd provided it. He could do it. He could turn back to the Empire, full attention, the focused killing intensity that had built it in the first place. And in 3 weeks, the Renetti situation would be contained and the northern operations would be intact, and everything would be exactly as it had been. And Margaret Lawson was on a train to Boston with a letter. He sat with both of those facts and felt them pull in opposite directions. Then his phone rang. Not Marcus's line, not the operational phone. His personal cell, the number that almost nobody had. He looked at the screen. Margaret. His stomach did something unusual. He answered. "Something happened," Margaret said. Her voice was controlled but tight in a way he'd never heard from her. "I need you to listen to me carefully. Tell me." "I got to Boston this morning. I went to the address your man gave you." A pause. He could hear her moving, a door, the sound of wind. "She wasn't there. The apartment was closed up. I talked to the building manager. He said she left 4 days ago. Said she told him she needed somewhere quieter." Another pause. "Damien. Someone else had been to the building before me, asking the same questions." The room got very cold. Who? He said. The building manager described two men. One of them matches Petrov's driver, the one who's been with him for the last 2 years. Damien was on his feet before he consciously decided to stand. What did they tell him? They said they were from your organization, that they were her security detail and needed to verify her location for her protection. Margaret's voice was very careful now. The building manager gave them the forwarding information she'd left in case her mail needed to be redirected. And they have it. They have it. Yes, the call from Marcus came on the other line simultaneously. Not a coincidence, he understood suddenly. The timing of it, the way it arrived in the same moment. He ignored it. Margaret, where is she? A coastal town. The building manager said she mentioned a place called Garnet Cove. It's about 40 minutes north of the city. Margaret's voice dropped. Damien, if Petrov gave that information to Renetti, he did. The certainty of it was immediate and physical, like something clamping around his sternum. That's the move. That's why Petrov was at the meeting. Not for the money, for this, for something Renetti could use. Why would Renetti? Because Renetti needs leverage that money can't provide. His voice was flat and fast and had shed everything that wasn't operational. He needs something I can't replace or negotiate around, something that makes my decision tree collapse to a single option. He was already moving, already through the office door. Claire's not a target, she's a pressure point. The threat of her being in danger is enough. That's all he needs. He was in the hallway, moving toward the stairs, and he was calling Marcus back as he moved, and Marcus picked up on the first ring, and Damien said, Petrov's position? Right now. And Marcus said, he left the city this morning. We lost the track an hour ago, which was the confirmation he didn't need because he already knew. Get my car, Damien said. Damien, get my car, Marcus. Now. He was down the stairs and at the door, and he stopped there for 1 second, one complete stop, because he needed to think rather than just move, and he knew it. This was the moment where moving too fast made things worse instead of better. He stood at the door with his hand on the frame and made himself breathe and think. Petrov had the forwarding address as of 4 days ago. If Renetti had instructed Petrov to do something beyond location confirmation, it would already have happened, and Margaret would have found something worse than a locked apartment. The fact that she'd found only a closed-up apartment meant Claire had moved before Petrov got there, or Petrov was still in observation mode, gathering information before committing to an action, which meant there was still time. Not much, but some. He called Victor. Tell me you already know about Petrov, Victor said. I know. And that you know what this means. Tell me what you think it means, Damien said. Not because he didn't know, because he needed Victor's version of it, the map from another perspective, before he moved. It means Renetti has been more organized than we gave him credit for. Victor's voice was tight now, the tightness of a man facing a situation that exceeded his contingency planning. He didn't just want the northern operations. He wanted a hard counter if you came back strong, something that would make you hesitate, or comply, or step back from the conflict. A pause that felt long in the way that pauses feel long only when the information on the other side is genuinely bad. He wants Claire, Damien, not physically. He's not a stupid man, but he wants you to know she's visible to him. That's the message. Stay back or the message gets louder. Damien stood at the door of his house and felt, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely afraid. Not of Renetti. He wasn't afraid of Renetti. I was afraid of the 40 minutes between Chicago and a coastal town called Garnet Cove, and what those 40 minutes contained, and the fact that he was the reason Claire was there, alone, in an apartment she'd chosen to disappear into, and the reason she'd had to disappear at all, and the reason she was now findable by men who understood her value only as pressure on him. He had brought his world to her doorstep by leaving her in it. The car arrived and he got in. Marcus was in the front seat. Damien looked at him, and Marcus looked back and didn't say anything about protocols or backup or waiting for more information, because Marcus had been watching Damien Whitmore for 12 years, and he understood that this was not an operational conversation anymore. Garnet Cove, Damien said. Marcus drove. The highway was gray and fast, and the city fell away behind them, and Damien sat in the back and looked at his phone and found the letter he'd sent Margaret to deliver still in his jacket pocket, the envelope with Claire's name on it in his handwriting, and he held it in both hands and looked at it and understood with the specific clarity of someone who has waited too long that the cost of every choice compounds. He had chosen the organization over her, again and again, until the choosing had become invisible to him, habitual, the default setting of a life built around control. And now the organization, or a fracture of it, a man who had watched him and calculated and decided the window was open, had followed her to the coast. He had done this. Not Renetti, not Petrov. Him. The car moved north, and the lake appeared on the right side, gray and cold and enormous. And Damian Whitmore held a letter he hadn't read to a woman he hadn't chosen enough times, in a car going 75 miles an hour toward a town she had gone to in order to be free of him, and he sat with all of it. The highway north of Chicago does not offer scenery so much as it offers distance, flat, gray, relentless distance, the kind that makes you aware of how much space exists between where you are and where you need to be. Marcus drove at 78 miles an hour without being told to, and Damian sat in the back and watched the mile markers, and did not look at his phone except once, when Margaret texted a single line, "No movement at the building. I'm watching the street. Good." That meant Petrov's people were either still in position or had already moved to Garnet Cove. Neither option was clean. He called Victor. "I need you to find out if Renetti has anyone in Garnet Cove," Damian said. "Not Marcus's channels, your channels, the ones that don't require a paper trail." "Working on it," Victor said. He'd already started, which meant he'd anticipated the call, which meant Victor was one step ahead of this in the way he was always one step ahead of things he was worried about. "Damian, when you get there, what's the plan?" "Get to her first." "And after?" "I'll know after." "That's not a plan." "Victor." His voice was very flat. "Find out about Renetti's people." He hung up. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror once and then looked back at the road. Smart man, Marcus. Garnet Cove was a town of maybe 4,000 people stretched along a narrow strip of shore that the lake had spent decades trying to reclaim. The main street ran parallel to the water and was the kind of main street that had been photographed for regional magazines as an example of resilient small-town America. A bakery, a hardware store, 2 restaurants that closed at 8, a small inn that operated year-round for reasons that primarily had to do with fishermen and people who needed to be somewhere quiet. In October, the tourist traffic was gone, and the town had contracted back to its actual size, which was small and known, and the kind of place where a woman staying alone in a rental would be noticeable within 48 hours. Which meant people knew she was here. Which meant that if Petrov had asked the right questions at the right diner, her location was not a secret. Marcus took the exit, and Damian felt the tension change register. Not less, but different, the way tension changes when the distance collapses into immediate geography. They were here. The lake was visible on the left now, iron gray and choppy from the wind, and the town appeared around a curve in the road. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked. "There's one inn. Start there." The inn was called Lake Point, and it occupied a converted Victorian house on the corner of Main and Harbor. The woman at the front desk was 60-something, had the patient expression of someone who had been answering questions about room availability for 20 years, and looked at Damian and Marcus with the specific alert quality of a small-town person who can identify outsiders on sight. Damian leaned on the desk. Man made a decision in the space of a breath, not the approach of a man with resources demanding information, but something else, something he almost never used because it required a kind of openness he had spent his adult life building walls against. He told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. "My wife is staying somewhere in this town," he said. "We've been separated. Not because she did anything wrong, because I did. I need to find her before someone else does, and the someone else is the problem, not me finding her." He held the woman's gaze. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to decide." The woman looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him. He let her. "She's not here," the woman said. "But there's one rental property on the water, the Haverford Cottage, about a mile north. Older woman dropped off a guest there 3 days ago." She paused. Quiet woman, kept to herself. "Thank you," Damian said. They were back in the car in 40 seconds. The Haverford Cottage sat on a narrow lot at the end of a gravel road that terminated at the lake's edge, surrounded by stands of birch that had lost most of their leaves and now stood pale and skeletal against the gray sky. It was a small house, 1 story, weathered wood, a covered porch facing the water. The kind of place designed to make people feel small in a way that was supposed to be peaceful. There was a light in the window. There was also a dark SUV parked at an angle in the gravel turnout 40 meters from the cottage, engine running, which meant someone was in it, which meant they'd arrived first. Marcus saw it at the same moment Damien did. He slowed without being told. Two people in the vehicle, Marcus said, reading the silhouettes. Driver and one passenger. Petrov? Can't tell from here. Damien made the calculation fast. If Petrov's people were still in the vehicle, they hadn't moved on the cottage yet. They were watching. That meant they were waiting for something, an instruction, a confirmation of plan, Petrov himself. It also meant that if Damien moved now, before they moved, he could get to Claire before the situation escalated into something that couldn't be walked back. Drive past them, Damien said. Don't slow down. Pull around the back of the cottage. Marcus accelerated smoothly. Not a suspicious deceleration, just a car passing on a gravel road, and Damien watched the SUV as they went past. The passenger window was partially down. The man inside was looking at the cottage. He didn't turn to look at their car, which meant either he was very focused or he was very bad at this. Either way, they had seconds. Marcus pulled around the far side of the cottage and stopped. Damien was out of the car before it had completely stopped moving, gravel shifting under his shoes, the wind off the lake hitting him like a physical thing, cold and wet and direct. He moved to the back door of the cottage and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Claire, it's Damien. I need you to open the door right now. Silence. Then, from inside, the sound of movement. Careful, deliberate movement. The kind that meant she'd heard him and was deciding whether his presence was better or worse than whatever she'd already intuited about the car in the lot. Claire, his voice dropped, stripped of everything except the fact of it. There are two men in a vehicle at the end of your driveway. They work for someone who wants to use you to pressure me. I need you inside, away from the windows, right now. We can have every other conversation after. A long pause. The door opened. She was in jeans and a gray sweater, hair down, and she looked at him the way you look at something you've been trying not to think about when it suddenly appears at full scale in front of you. Her expression moved through three things fast: surprise, anger, something complicated he didn't have a name for, and then it settled into the particular focused calm of a woman who had spent 3 years adjacent to danger and knew how to locate herself inside it. How many? She said. 2 confirmed, maybe more. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door. The cottage interior was small and clean. A kitchenette, a main room with a couch and a table, bookshelves with someone else's books. Her bag was against the wall. The first edition novel was on the table. Her coffee cup was still there from this morning or whenever she'd last sat down, half empty, the surface of it cold now when he registered its presence. She stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed, not defensively, the way people cross their arms when they're afraid, but with the contained quality of someone organizing their response before they deliver it. Marcus is outside? She asked. Yes. So there are 3 of you, and 2 of them. Yes, but I don't know if they've called for more, and I don't know exactly what their instruction is yet, and I'd like to resolve this without finding out the hard way. Claire looked at him. Her jaw was tight. You brought this here, she said. Not an accusation, a fact, delivered with the precision of someone who has been processing anger long enough that it's become something clear and cold rather than hot. Yes, he said. I know. You tracked me. For your safety. And then someone else used the same information. She looked away, looked at the window, at the light. She was calculating something. What do they want? They want me to know you're visible to them. It's leverage, Renetti. Someone who's trying to take pieces of my organization. He wants me to hesitate or comply rather than fight back. And if you fight back, the threat to you gets louder. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the breath she took that was slower than the one before it. He thought about how much he had underestimated her across 3 years, how often he'd assumed her quiet was passivity when it was actually processing. She'd never been passive, she'd been patient, and then she'd been done being patient, and those were not the same thing. Okay, she said, so what's the move? Outside, a car door opened. Damien went to the side window. staying back from it, to the edge, where he could see without being visible, and saw one of the men from the SUV moving toward the cottage. Unhurried, like someone on a straightforward errand. He was large, in a dark jacket, hands visible, which meant either he wasn't planning anything violent or he was confident enough not to need the display. Marcus appeared at the corner of the cottage at the same moment, having read the situation, and positioned himself between the approaching man and the back door without making it look like that's what he was doing. 20 years of working with Damien had given Marcus an instinct for geometry. Damien moved to the front door of the cottage and opened it before the man could knock. The man stopped. I was maybe 40, square-faced, with the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to stay professional, regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said. "Not surprised to see him. Mr. Renetti would like a word." "I imagine he would." "He's not far, if you're willing." "And if I'm not willing?" The man's expression didn't change. "He thought you might feel that way. He said to tell you the conversation you and he need to have is one that should happen in person, and that the alternative to having it is messier for everyone." A pause. His words. Damien looked at him for a moment. He was reading everything. The posture, the hands, the micro-expressions around the eyes. The man was professional and nervous in equal measure, which told Damien this was a delivery job, not an operation. Renetti hadn't sent muscle. He'd sent a messenger, which meant Renetti was close and wanted direct contact. "Where?" Damien said. "There's a restaurant in town. Crestwater. He's reserved the back room." Damien thought for 3 seconds. Every instinct he'd built over 2 decades of operating in dangerous rooms told him that Renetti requesting a restaurant meeting rather than an operational move meant he was still in the negotiation phase. Men who wanted to actually hurt you didn't invite you to dinner first. They just moved. The restaurant was Renetti telling him that this could still be resolved at a table. The question was what resolution Renetti had in mind. He looked back at Claire, who was standing in the middle of the cottage and had heard everything. "Don't leave," he said to her, quietly. "You don't get to tell me." Claire. Just her name. And something in the way he said it, some quality that was not authority, but something more exposed than that, made her stop. "Please." She looked at him for a moment. "Marcus stays," she said. "Marcus stays." She nodded once. Crestwater was 6 blocks from the cottage, a restaurant with low ceilings and fishing nets on the walls, and the smell of the lake permanently worked into the wood. The front of house was empty, closed for a private event. A sign on the door said, which was the kind of arrangement that could be made in a small town with the right amount of cash moved quickly. The messenger led Damien through the dining room and through a door at the back. Sal Renetti was sitting at a table with a glass of water and no food, and the composed expression of a man who had been in rooms like this many times and found them neither stressful nor pleasurable, just functional. He was 61, compact, dressed in a dark suit that was expensive without being showy. He looked like an accountant who'd made good choices and bad friends, which was not entirely inaccurate. He gestured at the chair across from him. Damien sat down. Renetti looked at him for a moment. "You got here fast," he said. "I'm motivated." "I can see that." Renetti's voice was even, deliberate, each word placed with care. "I want you to understand something before we discuss terms. What I've done is a business action, not a personal one. I have nothing against you personally. I have very high regard for what you've built." "Then why are we here?" "Because what you've built is losing cohesion." Renetti picked up his water glass, set it back down. "You've been operating at diminished capacity for 6 weeks. Key relationships are reading that as a signal. I moved to address the signal, not to create a conflict." He paused. "I'm not your enemy, Damien. I'm your competition. Those are different things." Damien looked at him. "You used my wife as a location point. I used a publicly accessible address that your own people established. I sent a man to observe, not to engage." Renetti's expression was steady. "I wanted you to know she was visible. That's all. That's the message." "And if I don't find the message acceptable?" Renetti's eyes didn't move. "Then we have a longer, more expensive conversation that neither of us needs." He set both hands flat on the table, palms down. A deliberate gesture, unhurried. "Here's what I want. The northern distribution channels, formalized through Alara. Your organization retains everything south of the state line. I take north. Clean separation, no conflict, proper compensation for the network assets. You want me to give you a third of my operation. I want to buy a third of your operation, at fair value, during a period when you're clearly in the middle of a significant personal restructuring. Renetti's voice was very even. You can refuse. You can come back strong, and we can spend the next year in a resource conflict that hurts both of us and benefits neither. Or you can take the money and use the clarity to focus on whatever has been pulling your attention for the last 6 weeks. He paused. I don't care about your marriage. I don't care about your personal life. What I care about is structure and function. Right now your structure is stressed, and your function is impaired. I'm offering you a transaction that addresses both. The room was very still. Damien looked at the man across from him and felt the whole of it. The years of building, the network, the reach, the specific satisfaction of controlled expansion. And he felt what it would mean to sell a third of it. The real meaning of it, not the financial figure, but the signal it sent. The signal that said I could not hold it all together. He'd spent his entire life never sending that signal. Renetti let the silence sit. He was good at silence. Men who negotiated from genuine strength usually were. There's a condition, Damien said. Renetti waited. The men you have watching that cottage are gone in the next 10 minutes. Not reassigned, gone. Out of this town, out of this county. And if I hear of anyone connected to your organization within 40 miles of my wife's location for the next 6 months, the deal is void and we have the other conversation. Renetti studied him for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and removed his phone and made a call. 3 words, 2 of them names, 1 of them a direction. Then he put the phone away. Done, he said. Then I need 48 hours to review the terms. You have 24. Damien looked at him. 48. Renetti held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. Damien stood. He looked at Renetti the way he'd looked at 100 men across 100 tables over 30 years, measuring the whole of the person, the architecture of what they wanted and what they'd do to get it. Renetti was what he said he was. Competition, not enemy. A practical man who had seen an opening and moved into it with precision. The opening had been Damien's distraction, his own absence from himself. He walked out of the restaurant. Outside, the wind off the lake was violent now, the kind of October wind that came in off the water, cold enough to make your eyes water. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in and felt his chest work against the cold and didn't move. His phone rang. Marcus. The SUV just left, Marcus said. Both men, headed south. Good. You okay? Call me back in 5. He hung up and stood on the sidewalk in a town he'd driven to in a car going 78 miles an hour because the alternative was unthinkable. And he let the wind hit him, and he thought about what he'd just agreed to consider. 24 years of building something, and a man had sat down with a glass of water and offered to buy a piece of it, and Damien had said he'd think about it. Not no. Not the immediate, absolute rejection that his younger self, the self that had built the organization brick by deliberate brick, would have given. He'd said he'd think about it. He walked back toward the cottage. Marcus met him 20 meters from the door, fell into step beside him. What happened? Renetti wants to buy the northern channels. Marcus absorbed that. And? And I told him I'd think about it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's not a no. No, Damien said. It isn't. They reached the cottage. Damien knocked twice before opening the door. Claire was at the table, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, even though it had been cold for hours. And she looked at him when he came in with the same complicated expression she'd had when she opened the door, moving through things too fast to name. He sat down across from her. Not beside her. Across from her. The table between them. He set the letter on the table. The envelope with her name on it, the one he'd given Margaret to deliver, that had ridden in his jacket pocket all the way from Chicago and through a meeting with a man who wanted a piece of everything he'd built. I wrote this 3 nights ago, he said. Margaret was supposed to bring it to you. Claire looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. What does it say? She asked. The truth. What I got wrong. Not what I'm going to do differently. I know you've heard that version. Just what's true. He paused. I'm not asking you to read it right now. I'm not asking you to respond to it. He stopped. Started again. I needed you to know it existed before anything else happens. Claire looked at him. Outside, the lake was audible through the walls, persistent, irregular, the sound of water that had no agenda except to keep moving. It had been doing that since before the town existed and would be doing it long after, and that fact was either comforting or terrifying depending on where you were sitting. Damien, Claire said, her voice was very careful. What did you agree to in there? Nothing yet. But you're considering giving him the northern operations. He looked at her directly. Yes. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He took a breath that he was aware of taking, the air filling his chest, cold still from outside. Because I realized on the drive here that I've been making the same calculation for 20 years and getting the same result and calling it success. His voice was even, but there was something unsteady underneath it, the way a floor sounds when the structure beneath it isn't what it used to be. And the result is an $8 million house that is completely silent and a woman who had to keep an apartment in Boston so she had one place that was entirely hers. Claire's hands tightened slightly around the coffee cup. That's not an apology, he said. I know you've heard apologies. That's just... He stopped again, looked at the letter. It's just what's true. The wind hit the cottage from the lakeside hard enough to rattle the window in its frame, a short, violent pressure, and then gone. And in the silence after it, Claire Whitmore looked at the man she had married 3 years ago, and the letter with her name on it, and the table between them, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached across the table and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and Damien watched her and didn't move and didn't speak, and the lake kept hitting the shore outside with the relentless indifference of things that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. And the moment sat there between them, balanced on its own edge, everything still possible and nothing yet decided. Claire held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Damien didn't move. He sat across the table with his hands flat on the wood surface and his coat still on because he hadn't thought to take it off. And he watched her hold the letter the way you watch something that is entirely out of your control and have to simply let be. The wind kept working at the cottage from the lakeside. The light through the window was the particular gray of late afternoon in October, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being considered rather than lived in. Finally, Claire set the envelope back on the table. Not returned to him, just set down. I'm not going to read it right now, she said. Okay. That's not me saying I won't ever read it. She looked at him steadily. It's me saying that I've spent 3 years reading the version of you that you decided I should see, and I need a minute before I take in another one. He absorbed that. It was accurate, and it wasn't unkind, and it landed the way accurate things land when they describe something you've been doing without fully seeing it. Okay, he said again. Outside, Marcus had positioned himself by the car, far enough away to be private. Claire glanced toward the window where the fading light caught the birch trees pale and stripped, and then she looked back at Damien. How did they find me? She asked. Petrov, one of my northern liaisons. He'd already gone to Renetti's side before I knew it. He got your forwarding address from your building manager in Boston. Damien paused. He told them he was your security detail. Something crossed her face. Brief, controlled, but he saw it. The specific expression of someone processing the fact that they had been made into a piece on someone else's board without their knowledge or consent. For how long? She said. How long did Petrov have the address? 4 days. And you've known about this since this morning. She nodded slowly. Not satisfied exactly. Recalibrating. So for 4 days, someone who wanted leverage over you knew where I was, and I had no idea. Yes. And the reason they could find me is because you tracked me first. Yes, he said. No softening, no qualifications, just the word. She looked at him with something he couldn't fully read. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something tired and precise underneath both of those things. You've always done that, she said. Tracked things. Made sure you knew where the pieces were, me included. I know. And you'd tell yourself it was care. That knowing where I was meant you were taking care of me. Yes. Even when you weren't there. Yes. His voice was very quiet. Claire stood. She moved to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the birch trees standing bare in the late gray light, and she was quiet for long enough that Damien became aware of his own breathing, the slight unsteadiness of it, the way his chest worked harder than it needed to just to move air in and out. "I made my own mistake," she said to the window. "I kept waiting for a version of you that was always there underneath. Like if I was just patient enough, or present enough, or careful enough about how I said things, eventually you'd surface." She paused. "I spent 3 years treating your potential like it was the same as your actual." He didn't respond. He let it be true in the room. That night at the gala, she turned around. Her face was controlled, but her eyes were doing something different than the rest of her face. Something rawer, less managed. "You didn't know I was standing that close." "No," he said. "I didn't." "Would it have changed what you said?" He sat with that. The real version of the question, not the flattering version. If he'd known she was standing there 8 feet away, would he have said nothing more than a contract with a signature? He went back to the moment. The young investor's raised glass, the ambient confidence of the room, the slight irritation of being praised for something he hadn't thought about in months. "I don't know," he said. "The honest answer is, I don't know. I might have said something softer, but the reason it came out the way it did is because some part of me believed it. Not entirely, not even mostly, but enough that it was close to the surface when I needed a quick answer." She looked at him. "I believed it," he said, "because I'd been treating you like a contract for so long that the line between what I thought and what was true had gotten blurred." The room was very still. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years, Claire said. Her voice was not warm. It was something more complicated than warm. It was the voice of someone who has been waiting for a real thing and is not sure whether to be relieved or furious that it finally arrived. "I know," he said. "I'm aware of that." She crossed her arms, not closed off, thinking. "What did you tell Renetti?" "I told him I'd consider the terms in 48 hours. "What are the terms?" "He wants to formalize control of the Northern distribution network through a group he's aligned with. In exchange, the organization retains everything else and receives fair compensation for the Northern assets." He paused. "It's a clean offer. From a business perspective, it's actually not a bad offer. But you're not deciding it from a business perspective." "No," he said. "I'm not." She studied him. "What happens if you refuse?" "We spend the next year in a resource conflict that costs both sides significantly. I probably win it. I have more structural depth than he does. But it costs time, money, attention, and it creates the kind of sustained instability that invites other people to test the edges." He looked at her directly. "It's the kind of conflict that becomes all-consuming, that requires the organization to be the only thing. Like it always has been." "Like it always has been," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "And if you accept? Then I lose a significant piece of what I spent 20 years building, and I have considerably more time and considerably less reason to be the person I've been." He paused. "And the Northern operations were always the most demanding part. The part that required the most travel, the most sustained attention, the most—" He stopped. "The part that consumed the most." Claire looked at him for a long time. "Damien," she said, "I need you to be very careful about what you do next." "I know. Not for me. I'm telling you that regardless of what happens between us, if you give up that piece of your organization as some kind of gesture toward me, and then it doesn't work, you will have lost both things. And I will not be the reason for that." "You're not the reason," he said. "You're—" He stopped, found the real sentence. "You're the evidence, the thing that made it impossible to keep not seeing what I was doing." He looked at the letter on the table between them. "I would have gotten here eventually, or I wouldn't have, and I would have ended up exactly what the world already thought I was. Either way, it was already happening. You leaving just—" He paused again. "You leaving made it immediate." Claire uncrossed her arms. She looked at the letter again. "I'm not coming back to Chicago," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." "I know. And I can't tell you right now that this is fixable. I don't know if it is." "I know that too." "Then what are you asking for?" He thought about that. What was he actually asking for? Sitting across a table from his wife in a rented cottage in a town he'd driven to at 78 miles an hour because the alternative was her being used as a pressure point. What did he want from this conversation that he hadn't already gotten, or given, depending on how you measured it? "Nothing," he said. I came because you were in danger. I'm staying because I needed you to have the letter. That's all. He paused. I'm not asking for anything, Claire. She looked at him with the most open expression he'd seen from her in years. Not warm, not forgiving, not the performed composure of gala dinners or the careful blankness of a woman retreating inside herself. Just her. Tired and real and standing in a cottage in a town she'd chosen for its quiet, holding a conversation she hadn't asked for, with a man who had driven 4 hours to deliver a letter and remove a threat she hadn't known was there. Okay, she said. Okay. Marcus knocked on the door at 6 o'clock. Damien stepped outside and Marcus handed him a phone, Victor holding the line. Renetti's people confirmed the withdrawal from Garnet Cove, Victor said when Damien put the phone to his ear. All clear on that end. Good. The Alara group hasn't formalized anything yet. You still have the window. A pause. Damien, I need to know what you're deciding, because if you're refusing Renetti, I need to start building the counter-strategy tonight. Damien stood on the gravel outside the cottage. The wind off the lake was sharp, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter, the light almost entirely gone now. Through the window he could see Claire at the table, her hands around her coffee cup again, looking at something he couldn't see from this angle. I'm accepting Renetti's terms, he said. Silence on the line. You're certain, Victor said. Not challenging, confirming. Yes. Another silence. Then Victor said, all right. Just that. All right. 30 years of partnership compacted into a single word that meant, I understand and I'll support it, and I have questions, but this isn't the moment. I'll be back tomorrow, Damien said. We'll work out the terms together. Don't let Nora schedule anything for the afternoon. Understood. A pause. Is she all right? She's all right. Good. Victor's voice was quieter now. That's the thing that matters. He hung up. Damien stood outside for a moment longer. He looked at the lake, which was invisible now in the failing light except as sound. The specific sound of large water moving in the dark, indifferent and continuous and real. He stood with it. The wind moved through the bare birch trees with a dry, papery sound, and he stood with that too. Then he went back inside. The next morning was cold and clear, the storm system having moved east overnight and left behind the kind of October air that had no ambiguity in it, bright, exact, sharp enough to feel on your face. Claire was up before him. She'd slept in the bedroom. He'd slept on the couch without being asked to and without it being discussed. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of her moving quietly in the kitchen. He sat up and looked at the room in the morning light. The first edition novel was still on the table. The envelope was gone. He didn't ask about it. She handed him a coffee without ceremony and sat across from him at the table, and they were quiet for a while, both of them looking at the window and the birch trees and the slice of lake visible between them, catching the morning light in a way the night version of the lake did not allow. I read it, she said. He looked at her. Last night. She held her coffee cup with both hands. After you were asleep. He waited. The thing about the dinner, she said. The French technique thing. Her voice was careful, factual. I'd been planning that for 2 weeks. I watched 3 videos. I called my mother twice to ask about the sauce. She paused. I didn't tell you any of that because I wanted it to be, I don't know. I wanted it to just happen and have you be there and notice. She looked at the lake through the window. You ate it standing up in 4 minutes and thanked me and left. Yes. I put the rest of it in the trash. I know, he said. I found the containers the next morning. He looked at his coffee. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to say anything that would have helped. So I didn't say anything at all. That was the year you stopped saying most things. Yes. Why? He thought about it. The real answer, not the managed one. Because somewhere in the first year, I started treating the marriage the way I treat everything else I'm responsible for. I assessed it, determined it was stable, and redirected my attention to the things that felt less stable. He paused. And every time I redirected, it became slightly more stable to ignore, until I'd built a version of it in my head that was running fine, and the version in the house was falling apart, and I'd stopped checking which one was real. Claire looked at him directly. That's exactly what happened. Yes, and you knew some part of that. Some part of it, he said. Not enough. She set her cup down. She put her hands flat on the table. He noticed the absence of the ring, the faint line on her finger where it had been, and she looked at them for a moment. "There's something I have to tell you," she said. "Something you don't know." He went still. "I almost left in February," she said, 8 months ago. I'd gotten to the point where I'd actually looked at apartments in Boston and made a list of what I'd take. I'd even called a lawyer, not filed anything, just a consultation. She paused. "And then you came home one night and you were tired in a real way, not the managed tired, and you sat at the kitchen table without your phone and you just sat there for an hour, and I thought—" She stopped, tried again. "I thought, there he is. That's the man. So I stayed." Damien looked at her. "I stayed because of 1 hour at the kitchen table," she said. "And then it went back to the way it was, and I told myself it was a season, and I kept telling myself that. And then October happened." She looked at her hands. "I need you to know that I'm not someone who didn't try. I'm not someone who gave up too easily." "I know that," he said. "I've always known that." "Do you?" She looked up. "Because for a long time I thought you saw my staying as passive, like I was just there, like furniture, not like someone who was making a choice to stay. I see it now," he said. "I didn't see it right." She nodded, slow, almost to herself. "The letter is good," she said. "What you wrote. It's the most clearly I've ever heard you." She paused. "I don't know what to do with it yet." "You don't have to do anything with it. I know." She picked her coffee back up. "That's new. You used to need everything resolved." "I still do," he said. "I'm working on it." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a movement in the direction of one, a softening at the corners of her mouth that was probably involuntary and that she didn't seem to be performing for him. They sat with the morning and the coffee and the lake and the birch trees. He left at 10. He did not ask her to come back. He said he would call, and she said okay, and he understood that okay in this context meant I'm not refusing that rather than I want you to, and he took it for exactly what it was. Marcus drove. Victor called before they'd cleared the county line. "Renetti's lawyer wants to start term negotiations this week," Victor said. "I told him Thursday. Thursday's fine." Also, a pause. "Callahan wants a meeting, not organizational, personal. Set it up." And Nora flagged something. A letter came to the house for Claire, forwarded from the Boston address. Victor's voice was careful. "It's from a gallery in Chicago, the one she mentioned wanting to see." Damien was quiet for a moment. "When did she mention it?" "At the gala. You asked about it at dinner." He had asked about it. He'd listened for 20 minutes and then his phone had buzzed and the 20 minutes had ended. He'd thought afterward that at least he'd asked. He'd given himself credit for the asking and not examined what had happened after. "Hold the letter," he said. "I'll bring it to her." "When?" "When it's the right time." He paused. "Not as a gesture. When it's just a thing I'm giving her because she should have it." Victor was quiet for a moment. "You've changed the way you talk," he said. "Did you notice that?" "Not yet, but I believe you." The drive back to Chicago took just under 2 hours. Damien sat in the back and didn't look at his phone and watched the landscape shift from the spare, flat openness of the lake country back into the accumulating density of the city. The first suburbs, then the thicker suburbs, then the city proper, the skyline appearing on the horizon and growing as they approached. He'd built a significant portion of his adult life in and around that skyline. The organization, the reputation, the specific weight of being Damien Whitmore in a city where that name had meaning. He looked at the skyline coming up and felt something unfamiliar. Not pride exactly, and not its absence either. Something more neutral than either. Something like seeing a thing clearly for the first time. The Renetti negotiation took 11 days. Damien sat at the table for every session, which was unusual. He normally sent his legal team for the preliminary sessions and came in at the end. This time he was there from the start, and the effect was what it usually was when Damien Whitmore decided to be fully present somewhere. Things moved faster, and the terms were better. Renetti's team had come prepared for a wounded organization and found an intact one, and had adjusted accordingly. The final terms were not as generous to Renetti as the original offer had implied. The northern channels transferred, yes, but with conditions and embedded rights of first refusal on 3 strategic corridors that Damien had quietly valued, and that Renetti's team hadn't flagged as leverage points until they were already conceded. Victor watched this happen with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as Victor ever permitted himself in a professional setting. "You sandbagged him," Victor said afterward, in the car. "I negotiated," Damien said. "You let him think he had more than he did, and then you cashed in the delta at the end." "Victor, I'm not criticizing. I know. I'm saying—" Victor looked at him. "I'm saying you were fully there. For 11 days you were completely there. I haven't seen that in 6 months." Damien looked out the window. "I've been fully somewhere else for 6 months." "I know. But it appears being fully somewhere else and being fully here aren't as mutually exclusive as I thought." Damien thought about that. He called Claire twice during the 11 days. The first call lasted 4 minutes. She was at a bakery she'd started going to in the mornings, she said. The owner was a woman named Dottie, who was 71 and had opinions about everything, and the coffee was bad, but the company was excellent. He listened to her say this and felt the particular sensation of hearing someone be themselves, not a version of themselves, not a role, and thought, this is who she was before, and understood that the town had given her something back that he wasn't sure he could have given her. The second call was longer. She asked about the negotiation, and he told her plainly what had happened and what it cost and what it meant. She asked good questions. She had always asked good questions. He had not always answered them. This time, he answered them. At the end, she said, "I got the letter from the gallery." "I know. Victor held it until I could bring it." "You haven't brought it." "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because you said you needed space, and I'm trying to understand what that means in practice, instead of just agreeing to it and then showing up anyway." A pause on her end. "That's a very accurate description of what you normally do." "I know." Another pause. "The show runs through December. If you wanted to bring the letter in person at some point." She stopped. "That's not me asking you to come. That's me saying the window exists." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He went 3 weeks later. He drove himself, not Marcus, just him, in a car that wasn't the organization's car, on a Wednesday afternoon when there was nothing scheduled that Victor couldn't manage. He drove north along the lake, and the landscape did the same thing it had done the first time, contracting and quieting as the city fell away. He brought the letter. He also brought a paper bag from a bakery near his house in Chicago. Nothing specific, just pastries, because it was morning and he'd driven past the bakery and thought about the place called Dottie's and wanted to bring something that wasn't a gesture, just a thing. Claire opened the cottage door and looked at the paper bag and then at him. "You brought pastries," she said. "The bakery near my house." She took the bag and looked inside it. "These are good." "I know." She stepped back and let him in. They sat at the same table, the same window, the same birch trees, though the leaves were completely gone now, and what remained was pure structure, the actual architecture of the trees, visible now that there was nothing decorative left on them, bare and clearly themselves in the November light. She opened the gallery letter, read it, handed it to him so he could read it. A curator's note, describing a collection of American landscape paintings from the mid-20th century, the kind of work that was unfashionable for decades and was being reconsidered. The language was careful and enthusiastic in equal measure. He handed it back. "Is this something you'd want to go to?" he asked. "Yes." She folded the letter. "I was thinking of going next week, actually. I've been doing things I want to do. It's been strange. Good strange." "What else?" She looked at him. "What else have I been doing?" "Yes." She thought for a moment, which was itself something. The thinking about it, the consideration. "I went kayaking last week. I've never done that. I was terrible at it." She paused. "I've been writing. Not anything specific, just writing. And I've been sleeping 8 hours, which I haven't done regularly in years." "What were you writing?" "Things." She looked at the window. "About the last 3 years. About the last 10 years, actually. About who I was before I was Mrs. Whitmore." She paused. "It's not for anyone, it's just, I needed to put it somewhere outside my head." "Is it helping?" Slowly. She looked back at him. "Are you sleeping?" "Better than I was." "Victor says you've been different in meetings." "Victor talks to you?" "We exchange messages sometimes." He started it. A slight pause, something wry in it. He worries about you. Victor worries about everything. He worries about you specifically. She looked at him. He told me you turned down the Alara expansion 6 weeks before the gala. He said you'd been... She paused. He said you'd been trying to pull back before I left. That it had started before. Damien was still. I didn't know Victor told you that. He didn't tell me as a defense of you. He told me as context. She set the gallery letter down. I'm not recalculating everything based on that, if that's what you're thinking. I wasn't thinking that. You were a little bit, maybe slightly, he said. Something moved through her expression, that same not quite smile from the morning after, slightly more there this time, slightly less involuntary. She picked up her coffee. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to not frame the answer, just say what's true. All right? What do you actually want? Not for the organization, not what makes sense, not the practical version. What do you want? He sat with it, the real version. Not the version that would land well, or that showed awareness, or that demonstrated growth. Just what was true. I want to have dinner with you at a table, he said, and not leave before it's over. She looked at him. I want to know what you're writing about, not to help you fix it or organize it, just to know. He paused. I want to drive up here on a Wednesday with pastries and have that be an ordinary thing instead of a significant event. Another pause. And I want to know your neighbor Dottie thinks is wrong with the world, because you said she has opinions about everything, and I believe that about her. Claire looked at him for a long time. Then she said, she thinks the whole country forgot how to be bored. She says boredom is what makes people interesting, and everyone is so busy avoiding it that they're all becoming the same. She paused. She's probably not wrong. She's not wrong at all, Damien said. They sat with that. The gallery show was in 2 weeks. He drove up the following Wednesday with nothing. No letter, no pastries, just himself. Because she'd said the window existed and he believed in taking windows when they were open rather than planning around them. She looked at him when she opened the door with an expression that said she'd half expected him and half not. I'm not staying, he said. I just wanted to... He stopped. I wanted to come. For no reason. She looked at him. Okay, she said. He stayed for 3 hours. They walked to the water because the afternoon was cold and still, and the lake in November had a quality neither of them could articulate, but both of them stood in front of for a while without needing to. He put his hands in his pockets. She pulled her collar up. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. She told him about a conversation she'd had with her mother, who had known from the second year that something was wrong and had never said anything because Claire had never asked, and her mother understood the difference between support and interference. She said her mother had cried a little on the phone when Claire called from the cottage the first week, which surprised her because her mother was not someone who cried easily. He told her about his father, something he almost never talked about, the specific quality of his father's attention, how it was enormous when it was present and how it was almost never present, and how Damien had spent his 20s building an empire partly to earn a version of that attention and partly to prove he didn't need it, and how those two things had lived in him simultaneously for so long that he'd stopped being able to separate them. She listened. She didn't offer anything about it. She just listened. That was the thing. He understood standing there with the lake in front of them and his hands in his pockets. She had always been good at that, at listening without converting what she heard into an action item or a conclusion. He'd been so bad at it for so long that he'd forgotten it was a skill. He'd been surrounded by people who processed information into strategy, himself included, and he'd stopped recognizing that some things were not information to be processed, but just true things that needed someone to witness them. She had been that for 3 years, and he had given her nothing of it in return. He said that to her, standing at the water. Not rehearsed, just out loud, the way it came. She looked at the lake for a moment, then she said, "You're doing it right now." He looked at her. "Witnessing things," she said. "You've been doing it differently, since you came that first time." She paused. "I don't know how to describe it exactly. You're slower. Not in a bad way. You used to move through spaces like you were managing them. Now you're just..." She paused again. "In them." "I'm working on it," he said. "I know." She glanced at him. "I can tell." They walked back to the cottage. At the door she stopped. "The gallery show," she said. "Next Thursday." "Yes." "If you wanted to come." She looked at him directly. Not as anything, just come. I'll come, he said. Okay. Okay. He drove back to Chicago and the skyline came up on the horizon the way it always did, and he looked at it and thought about what she'd said. You're just in them. He tried to remember the last time, before any of this, that he had simply been in a space without managing it, and he couldn't locate a specific memory, which told him something about how long it had been. He called Victor from the car. How's the organization? He said. Stable. The northern transition is clean so far. Callahan's handling the liaison restructuring well. A pause. Better than I expected, honestly. Good. And you? Damien watched the skyline. The lights of the city coming on in the early dark of November, building by building, floor by floor, all that light against the dark. He'd built something significant inside that skyline. He'd put years of himself into it and called it a life. And he wasn't wrong that it was something. It was something real and durable and hard-won. He just understood now that it was one thing, not the thing. I'm learning to be bored, he said. Victor was quiet for a moment. Is that a good thing? According to an elderly woman in Garnet Cove, it's the most important thing. Another pause. Then Victor said, I'd like to meet this woman sometime. I think you'd like her. I think I might. He hung up. In Garnet Cove, Claire sat at the table with the notebook that wasn't the one she'd taken with her from Chicago. This was a new one, bought at the hardware store in town because it was the only place that sold them. And the hardware store owner had looked at her buying a notebook with the same equanimity he looked at everything. And she wrote for a while. Not about Damien specifically, not about the marriage or the gala or the cottage or any of the specific events. She wrote about the version of herself who had stood in a boutique on Michigan Avenue 6 weeks earlier and held a burgundy gown against herself and thought, this is the one, and then immediately thought, he won't notice. She wrote about what it felt like to realize, slowly, over a Wednesday afternoon at a table with a paper bag of pastries, that the problem with that moment in the boutique wasn't that he hadn't noticed. The problem was that she'd known he wouldn't and had gone anyway, and told herself hope was the same as evidence. She wrote that she didn't know what came next, that she was not ready to decide, that ready was not what she was reaching for. She was reaching for real, for the thing that was actually true, as opposed to the thing that would hold together on the surface for another 3 years. She wrote that real was harder to build than anything she'd tried to hold together, and that she thought maybe that was the point, that the things worth having were worth the difficulty of making them actual rather than just functional. She closed the notebook. The lake was out there in the dark, doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous and enormous and real. She made tea. She sat with it by the window. She did not know how the next part went. She did not know if Chicago came back into her life or stayed at a Wednesday afternoon with pastries distance for a while longer. She did not know if the man who had said 30 words that ended something was genuinely becoming someone different, or if the becoming would hold past the difficulty of it. What she knew was that she was sitting in a cottage she had chosen, in a town she had found, drinking tea she had made, and that the woman who had stood in a boutique and bought a burgundy dress for a man she already knew wouldn't notice was not exactly her anymore. Not gone. You don't get rid of who you've been, but not the whole of her, not the loudest part. She thought about the painting show. Thursday. The particular pleasure of standing in a room full of old American landscapes and taking the time to actually look at them, the way you could look at things when you were not simultaneously monitoring someone else's reaction to them. She'd go alone. She'd decided that this morning. She'd asked him and she meant the invitation, but she'd go alone first and he'd meet her there and she'd show him the ones she liked rather than asking if he liked the same ones. That was new. She recognized it as new. A small thing that was actually a large thing, the way most real things were. Across the room, on the table, the letter he'd written, the fourth draft, the one that started with the dinner she'd spent 2 days preparing, lay in its open envelope where she'd left it after reading it the third time that afternoon. She had read it 3 times and would probably read it again, not looking for hidden meaning or testing it against a standard, but because it was the most clearly she had ever heard him and she was still adjusting to the frequency of it. He'd written, at the end, I don't know how to be what you needed. I'm learning what that means. She'd thought about those words for 3 weeks. She picked up the letter now, in the dark of the cottage with the lake outside, and she read that last paragraph one more time. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set it on the shelf above the table, where she put things she wasn't done with. The tea cooled, the lake moved, the birch trees stood bare and structural in whatever light the night provided. She sat with all of it and did not rush any of it, and the quiet was the kind of quiet you earn rather than the kind that gets imposed on you. And there was a significant difference between those two kinds. And she knew, sitting there in the November dark with a cooling cup of tea and a letter on the shelf above her, exactly which one this was.